Boom! This was a good one.
Wow, America, you need Phyllis Levitt. And if you don't know
Yeah,
already, you're about to find out. What an amazing conversation we had with her.
yeah. Super supportive in this realm of therapy and the politics of existence and the politics of America as an entity.
Yeah, and she broke it down so great. I can't wait for you to hear the way she takes this complex problem and she just brings it home. And then, of course, from that point, it expanded to, a bigger picture, a bigger issue, and how do we address it? Again, you are really in for a treat. It'll be fun. She's fun and educational at the same time. And of course, our special question at the end in this one is particularly good. So definitely stick around for the whole episode. Subscribe, like, share, and go to our website, mopedoutlaws.com, and do the things there.
Yep, and drink adrenochrome cola, and hopefully Mark will share publicly his thoughts of this idea about mathematics in our political system. Because we had a conversation off the air that was very worthy of public scrutiny.
Well, I'm working on the book.
Sis, hallo?
Levin.
Bestuur zeker wegen dem.
Yo iets niet, joh.
Sitaki ubenza, anika sirikie.
Two outlaws on the lam, taking the back roads through America.
You can't drink enough coffee for this show.
And now it's time for Monday Madness with the Moped Outlaws, Greg and Mark.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Moped Outlaws, where we love to take you on a wild ride through the intricacies of communication, human interaction, and the joys of being alive. Today, our guest is Phyllis Levitt, author, psychotherapist, and speaker. And she's just written a new book called America in Therapy, which is subtitled A New Approach to Hope and Healing for a Nation in Crisis. We're so glad you could make it, Phyllis. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much for having me with you on your great podcast. Thank you so much, really. I appreciate it.
And where are you in the world right now?
I am in Taos, New Mexico.
All right.
Wow.
What's the city?
Taos.
Taos.
It's a very small town, kind of north of Santa Fe, which is north of Albuquerque. So it's in the northern part of the state.
All right.
There's a lot of people, myself included, who have a relationship with the idea of Taos as being a kind of spiritual center. It's an artistic and spiritual center. Do you agree with that? And what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. It just, I lived in Santa Fe for a really long time, and I loved Santa Fe as well. And Taos just has its own unique, it's not built up, it's not industrialized. It has a very, very old pueblo. The Taos Pueblo is still here and alive. So there's a beautiful indigenous, community here. And Taos seems to draw people who are somewhat spiritually minded or environmentally minded. And I have found that to be true. I've made some really wonderful close friends here.
Thank you. And would you say there's this kind of spirituality that informs your life?
Totally. Totally. I kind of started out really well. I'm a lot older than you guys, and I was kind of a child of the 60s and the 70s, and spirituality was huge in the environment that I lived in. There were a lot of gurus coming over from India and different traditions that were coming to the United States. And I followed some of those paths for a while, and they were very helpful and very inspiring. But what happened for me is that I realized that I needed a different kind of healing that I didn't think my spirituality was going to give me. And that was just really on a psychological, emotional level. And so I turned to psychology. I went to a lot of therapy myself. I became a psychotherapist. And I've never lost that spiritual thread, but it's more integrated now into with a psychological approach to life.
Got it. And I hear you not giving it a name and therefore not pigeonholing it.
Yeah, there's no name. I mean, I started out with, in a Gurdjieff group, and then I was in a group with an Indian guru. But I never really identified with the group. I more identified with whatever the connection was that I was making to something more spiritual within myself. And so I don't belong to any organization.
I know that in my own awareness and my own experience of what I'll call awe and wonder of the universe, that I feel that in my belly button. And that I get this sense of belonging and connection. And I always notice the physical sensation comes right through that spot. And then it lights me up. Like I get goosebumps, and, like when you're looking out at a beautiful canyon or an amazing redwood forest,
Right.
all these different things. So how does spirituality impact you? What's your felt sense of having an awe-inspiring or spiritual experience?
Yeah, I mean, so many different ways. But if we started with the body, like you just did, I feel it in this very intense connection between my heart and my throat, and it's I don't know how to describe it, but it's like a very intense, wonderful, vibrational feeling that lights me up there. And I think partly, I think we all have different paths in life that are all valid and needed, and mine has always been to have a voice. So when I was really young, I didn't know why I wanted to be a writer, but I did when I was really, really young. I think sometimes you just come in that way. So that's my main connection, has always been through writing, but I also have a really strong relationship with nature and the earth. And sometimes some of my most spiritual experiences have come just by being in tune with something, some kind of love force that comes from nature.
Since the 60s, you said, well, how old were you in the 60s, if you don't mind my asking?
Well, I'm 77 now, so that'll tell you.
Okay. So was psilocybin or other elements of the earth a part of your spiritual journey?
It was for a lot of people, but not for me. For some reason, I never went that route. I felt I had such strong spiritual experiences without any plant medicine that I just never turned to any of that. But I know that it was very helpful and still is for many people.
All right. So I'm wondering, what is the crisis America is in?
Yeah, I mean, overtly, it looks like we have so much divisiveness and violence and threats of violence and escalating kind of intolerance of our diversity and different points of view and different approaches to life. And I call that a mental health crisis. And I know that we're being kind of told that it's an ideological or a partisan problem, which it is. But I see that I don't think that the issues that we're divided over are actually the problem. It's that people are not learning how to handle opposition or differences of opinion in a constructive way. We're always going to have disagreements. People are going to have different approaches to life, different beliefs, different genders, different economic, opportunities, different whatever we have, religions. And I don't think they're the problem. I think diversity is actually probably very much needed because we have different things to contribute from different points of view. I think the mental health issue is that we're not learning and we're not actually even valuing that we need to have a constructive way to deal with our differences. And that's nonviolent. And that's with, learning to really listen deeply to one another and be open to a different point of view, and look for resolution and look for how we can stay connected to each other, even if we disagree.
So as part of what you've done as a therapist is you have modes of healing that you've learned that work for individuals, and you now are saying that these practices can be implemented on a national whole?
Yes. And I mean, I'm hoping that we will have enough people advocating for that that we no longer condone the kind of violent rhetoric and the threats of violence and the intolerance of diversity that we're seeing today, because it's hurting people. And what I have learned as a psychotherapist is, a lot of exposure to different family dynamics. That's part of what we deal with today in psychotherapy a lot. What is the conditioning that people get in their homes? What are the role models for dealing with conflict? What are the role models for men and women? What are the rewards and consequences for different behaviors? What's expected of us? And so if you live in a relatively healthy family, and none of us does it perfectly, we're all learning as we go, but in a relatively healthy family, there's love. There's a sense of belonging. There's a feeling that other people are out for your best interests and not competing with you or excluding you. There are ways of dealing with conflict which arise in every family that are more constructive than others, where people sit down and they talk, or where they take a time out, or where the consequences for a child, let's say, are not harmful or abusive, but they're really intended to help a child gain appropriate limits and boundaries around their behavior and take in somebody else's reality as well as their own needs. All these things. And when people don't get them, when they're abused or neglected, or there's, expectations that they can't meet, or, no boundaries or rigid boundaries, or a lack of love, all the things that hurt people, then people become symptomatic. And what I have done in my book is look at our country through that same lens, because we're a family as a country. We're just a whole lot more people. But you can take sort of that. Go ahead. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm wondering, so if I came in and I came into your office as an individual with extreme abuse and trauma in my childhood and growing up, and now you're taking what this individual needs, and now we look at a nation, and you
Right.
talked about the indigenous people of Taos, and we also know people of color whose ancestors were from Africa and came here and
Right.
enslaved. There's extreme trauma in the
That's right.
DNA. Like, so how as a nation do we heal that?
Well, the first thing there's many steps to that, of course, but the first thing we do is actually name it for what it is. And we own that as a country, we have hurt people. We have hurt them terribly. And it's not us maybe living here today, although it may be some of us living here today, but it's in our history as a country. And one of the first things we look at with an individual in therapy is their history. What were their formative experiences? What did they learn about human relations? What did they learn about themselves? I'm lovable, or I'm unworthy. I'm useless, and I'm stupid. I'm ugly. I'm fat. People get all these messages. Or you're a wonderful human being, and you have a lot to contribute, and we want you here, and you're needed and wanted. We either get really good messages about ourselves, or really hurtful messages about ourselves, or some mixture. And those messages follow us into our adulthood. And to the extent, like you said, if someone is really terribly abused and mistreated, the messages they bring about themselves and other people into their adulthood are often totally colored by the terrible beliefs that they've taken on about themselves and other people in their early conditioning. And we have conditioning as a country. Many of the people that came here in the beginning and over many hundreds of years were immigrants who were fleeing persecution and trauma and poverty and war. Not everyone, but many of the immigrants who have come to this country were fleeing harm that was done to them from other people. And in those days, nobody talked psychology. People didn't heal their traumas. They came here trying to survive. But many of those traumas got passed down. How did we become a country that slaughtered so many people, that enslaved so many people. That's part of our history and part of our conditioning. And I think it's just like my own history and my own conditioning to face. And part of that, when we're talking about individuals in therapy or a family in therapy, is not only what happened to me that was hurtful, but what have I done that was hurtful? It's both of those that we're recovering from. So that's a beginning. It's just really owning our history and understanding, not for the sense of blame or shame or hating anyone, or being, retaliating, but for the sake of how do we heal that? How do I heal the negative messages I got about myself from the things in my childhood that weren't good? And what were the coping mechanisms that I developed that weren't so positive or constructive for me out of the negative messages I received? And it's no different for a country. And it's, of course, it's very individualized to different people in the country and different groups in the country. So it's complicated, but there are patterns to look at. Does that make sense?
Yeah. One of the more obvious, to me at least, methods and sources of this dysfunction is the competitive advantage that economics and the capitalist system leverage against us to perpetuate our division and our conflict with each other. And that
Right.
manifests as kinds of storytelling that have at their core a blame game, a good versus
Right.
evil dynamic
Right.
that positions people in certain groups and things like that. And if we look at it prior to media, like what's really easy to show, the for our generation, the Cowboys and Indians shows of the 60s on TV is one, but you go way further back, and what you have is you have stories that originate out of religious dogmas that perpetuate this idea of being led into heaven and having to have a value proposition that goes with that. And then that is essentially boils down to what I call the legacy of shame and blame.
Right. Absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think psychology and the best that we understand today about mental health and well-being and what creates that is so important, because and is the missing piece, I think, in our national conversation, and a huge missing piece, because psychology is about healing. It's not about shame. It's not about blame. We may have to look at our accountability or hold someone else accountable, but it's for the sake of healing. It's for the sake of coming back together if it's at all possible. When couples come to therapy, for instance, and they're fighting and they've hurt each other and they're about to split up or whatever they're doing, they each have something important to say. They each have a perhaps pain or injury that they need to have heard. But the purpose is not to blame anyone or say this one's right and that one's wrong and you're a bad person and this person's good. If one person really has acted out, which many of us have in our own lives in some way, the point is to heal whatever the underlying pain is that has caused that acting out and bring people back together. Imperfectly, of course, but in the direction of love and reconnection, because that's what brings peace and safety.
I want to ask you about identity, because a lot of severe trauma impact has the creation of an identity around the trauma response, and not even necessarily getting to the origin of the trauma, but people become identified with a character that they are. Some people call that a victim, but it's not always a victim. But we get perpetually our neurology gets ingrained with this idea of this identity that's the result of our trauma. And so it seems like people become fearful of the shift because they lose their sense of who they are as a result. Is that something you agree with? And how do you address that?
Just say something more about the last part. What shift are you talking about?
When one wants to resolve their trauma, if they've become identified with a character that's built around their trauma response, they can have a sense of identity loss when they decouple the trauma, when they deconstruct the trauma part, and they don't know who they are outside of that framework.
Yeah. So even though they're healing, they're moving out of a comfort zone that, even though it was an unhealthy comfort zone, there was an identity they had, and now they're losing their identity.
Well, I think this is particularly important for what we would call men of my age and color, who've
Mm.
been able to be the dominant paradigm, the
Old
control
white
mechanism.
Englishmen.
Yeah, white fragility, male white fragility. Let's just name it, right?
Mhm.
And so,
Mhm.
it's easy to identify the aspects of what the advantages are and why people adhere to that character and that set of beliefs and behaviors as a result of the advantages. But there's also trauma there. And so there's this element of how, and just beyond white fragility, really, how do you deal with, or do you even recognize this as a psychologist, that there's an addiction to the trauma identification of I am this?
Well, I would say I understand what you're saying. I would put a little bit different words to it from my experience,
Please
which
help
is
me.
which is that we just tend, all of us, to repeat what we know. We repeat what we know. If we know I'm a bad person, or I'm flawed, or I'll never amount to anything, or people are always going to hurt me, or I have to be aggressive to survive, or I have to dominate to be heard, then I'll repeat that. And for most people, what we've learned to do to survive, which was the best we could, sometimes it's just the role models we've been exposed to, or we've figured out, I better just disappear if I don't want to get hurt more. I try to make myself invisible. Whatever a person has done to try to survive something that's toxic for them or harmful for them, they tend to repeat. And so whether it's being a victim or being an aggressor, they're two sides of the same coin of having been hurt. And what I have found in my practice, I have not found people floundering in that place of, I've lost my identity, but I don't have a new one. And the reason why I haven't found that, and I'm not saying it doesn't happen for people, but I think the reason why I haven't seen that is because when people really get a chance to peel back the layers of the negative things that they've taken on from being hurt, they find a beautiful core essential self. And that becomes the beginning of a new identity. And that core essential self most often has some kind of dream or some kind of calling or some kind of something that becomes the new identity or becomes the focus of their energy, I guess is what I would say. Just because in there are these buried strengths and gifts. And when they get uncovered, we're called to manifest them in some way, whether it's just being more loving to our kids, and I shouldn't say just, being more loving to our kids, or being a social activist.
What's the new identity for America that you envision?
Yeah, I guess I would just say this. And what I have found, tell me why you're laughing.
Did you use the word just again?
No. What are America's pronouns?
Pronouns, he, she, it, they. I don't know. We. The pronoun is we. How's
Yes.
that?
I love it.
Let's have it. Yeah, let's have it. And that's
Thank
actually it. The pronoun is we. We are a family. We are human beings in a family, and in a healthy family, we look to take care of everyone. We really hope for the best for everyone. We try to encourage everyone to be their best self, to be their most fulfilled self. We try to provide for everyone. So we just take what we know makes a healthy family and we bring that to our country. And that's the we. And I think there's a great word that I heard somewhere that I've used now often, or a great phrase. It's called sovereign unity. And I think what it means is that there's a balance, an ongoing dynamic balance between the good of the individual within the good of the collective. And it's a constant conversation. It's not a fixed thing.
Speaking of indigenous, I love the story I've heard of the young youth coming to a wizened elder and saying, I've got this war inside me. And the elder saying, yes, we all have two wolves in us.
Right.
And the one you feed, which to me points that ultimately we have the personal responsibility of choosing the wolf we feed. So if
Mhm.
we're talking about healing and reparations and acknowledgement of the past, I find a personal struggle in being an ally to healing and also knowing that ultimately for healing to begin, it's an individual choice to begin it.
So what's the struggle?
The struggle is I tend to, with that sentence I just said, I fall easily into, well, it's a Black person's responsibility to start the healing process. It's an individual thing, which I feel in my body. That statement is now I'm beginning that oppressive white privilege element of an excuse not to engage in healing because
Mhm.
I've given the responsibility to someone else.
I'm not sure if I'm following you. You're given the responsibility to somebody else to heal rather than that you have any responsibility in their healing. Is that
Right, because I'm academically, I'm thinking, well, healing needs to start with the individual choosing to heal. Like if I walked into your office with everything going on and I'm not going to choose to do the work to heal, you as a wise healer are going to say, Greg, I can't help you. Right?
Well, I guess that this is what I would say, and you tell me if this speaks to your question or not, because it may not, but this is what I'm feeling when I'm talking to you, is that what I have found is that when people come to therapy, they're in pain. Something is really not working in their life. And they're in enough pain that they're open to explore some other avenue of looking at themselves and potentially behaving differently in the world or doing different things because what they're doing isn't working, right? And what I have found, and many people are just locked into that. They're so in pain or their life has become so dysfunctional that they're not thinking about anybody else really. They're just trying to survive. And that's true for a lot of people who have been very badly hurt. They're just in survival wherever they go. And when they have a chance to heal, when they have a chance to get to that innocent, pure person that they were before any of these terrible things happened to them, you know, they connect to a place of love and they connect to a place of caring. And I have never seen it not be true that when someone has a chance to heal, they want to share that with other people, whether it's the people in their own life or in some bigger venue. And you see that a lot, like in the field of addiction, for instance. There's so many people who have become sober and gone on a healing journey from their addiction who become addiction counselors because they want to give back what they've gotten. And so I don't think anyone has to force themselves to try to help other people. I think as we heal, we naturally become more relational, more kind, more giving, more generous, and more available to be of help to other people in whatever way might call to us. Does that speak to what you're saying?
Yeah.
Just letting this soak in. I mean, this is such a rich conversation. The most prescient thing, or the thing that's most on my mind right now is there's resistance to entering into the dynamic field of transformation. And I find that there's this aspect of denial and a lack of attentive desire to press into changing, to step into the arena, if you will. And so most of what I witness is that people don't choose to do that until there's some form of crisis or some
Right.
form, right? So how do we move this massive boat we call America towards this healing and avoid the level of wounding that will occur as a result of the necessary level of crisis required to get everybody to shift?
Well, I think it's going to take more than one of us. Let me just say that. I don't think there's a savior on the horizon. I think it's more than one of us doing whatever our part is that we feel called to do. And I know that that's why I wrote my book, because out of all my experience being a client and being a therapist over so many years, I couldn't help but share what I understood about through my lens of what's going on here. And I think one of the pieces is that we desperately need education. You know, when it was finally discovered that it was a bacteria that caused a plague or a virus or whatever it was, and it was in the water supply, then people knew where to go to try to stop the plague from spreading, right? And it's the same thing with our psyches, only it's way more complicated. So I think we need education. And what I try to bring forward in my book is that what we know of dysfunctional and abusive family dynamics have very distinct patterns. Abusers behave in certain ways. They justify what they're doing. They blame their victims for the abuse. They blame their victims for the symptoms of the abuse. They punish people for calling out the truth or trying to get help. They silence and even murder truth tellers. And they reward complicity with the abuse itself. And we see the exact same dynamics happening in our country on a very large scale. Not everywhere, of course, but in places that really seem to matter and are escalating. And I think people don't know. A lot of people just don't have any training. It's not that they're ignorant. They just really have never had any exposure to what these dynamics are and what the long-lasting effects are. People who are hurt by other people, who don't get help and don't, especially if they can't escape that hurt from other people, become highly symptomatic often. And that's the other part of what I think many people don't know. They become, and they're patterns that we see, and we see these over and over again, and individual therapists see them in their offices, and you can't help but identify them on a larger scale. People become depressed, they become highly anxious, they become suicidal, they become violent toward other people, they become antisocial, they become hermits, they become addicts. We become symptomatic when we're hurt by other human beings. We can't help it. Just like if the body is hurt, it becomes symptomatic. And we live in a culture, and this is one of many things that I try to talk about. We live in a culture where we blame our victims. Why is that population failing to thrive? Why aren't they doing better economically? Why aren't they taking better care of their children? Why do they treat their women that way? Why do they blah, blah, blah? Instead of understanding that there are actually understandable reasons why people do the harmful things that they do. And could we take responsibility ourselves as individuals and as a nation, because we're really locked together now, the individual welfare and the national welfare. Could we take responsibility for trying to help people instead of blame them and punish them and lock them up?
Well, a lot of BIPOC cultures and peoples are dealing with generational trauma,
Right?
and unwinding that is not as simple as it might sound. And so
Not at
what's your
all.
point of view on reparations?
Yeah, I think we start with ourselves. I think that's the best place to start. It probably isn't one among us who hasn't hurt somebody, even if we identify more as someone who's been hurt. You know, there's a saying that people are always quoting to me, hurt people, and we do, you know. And so I think we start with ourselves, and we really look at what it means to take responsibility for the things that we've done that aren't so great. And maybe they were the best we could do at the time with the information and the conditioning we had. But it doesn't mean that there isn't something we could take responsibility for and change. And when we praise that, you know, when we start to create a culture where it's actually something that we celebrate, that we could take responsibility for the harm we've done, or the unkind things we've said, or whatever, that we celebrate that's a strength that people could have. Go ahead.
All right. So what if we move past that origination step of self-healing and now we're in a larger space? Do you think reparations are appropriate as the larger part of healing?
Probably, but let me say this. I think where we would start and where reparations might naturally grow from would be actually sitting down and listening. And if you have ever read about or heard anything about, Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa, that's the model where those who hurt people and those who were hurt sat down and listened to each other deeply, safely, with the idea that accountability for the harm that people had done to one another and for the suffering that had been caused was not going to be punished. And I know that doesn't sit well with a lot of people, but it is the beginning of the way for people who have hurt other people, especially if they've really been in the perpetrator role, to hearing the impact of their actions is the beginning of their healing and taking accountability for it. And if the goal is healing and not just blame, shame, and punishment, then you have a way to begin to break the cycle. Because, and I talk about this quite a bit in my book, inside the perpetrator is an unhealed victim. And most people don't know that.
Boom. That was a mic drop for sure. Wow.
Well, if we look at the time of open slavery in the United States and the economics that were involved, and with that statement you said, inside a perpetrator of pain is a hurt person, what was the hurt person of the slave owner America? Thinking of a whole, not an individual. Again, because part of the premise of your book is America as the character and the individual. Okay. So what was hurt in that slave owner America?
Well, I don't know how to speak to an individual slave owner, but it sounds from and I'm not, a connoisseur of history. I don't know every in and out of our history or world history. Go ahead.
I'm wondering more, not the individual. I'm wondering the mass. What? Okay. Thinking of them, because that's what we're addressing, America as a mass, right?
I think what we're looking at is that we, and maybe never had fully, a sense of our shared humanity. And so if you're brought up not believing that everyone is an equal human being and entitled to love and belonging and safety and being supported and being provided for, if you're not brought up believing that all human beings are equal in that way, then it's a certain kind of injury. It might not be the trauma of overt abuse, but it's a mindset injury about the condition of our own humanity that then allows people to treat people like slaves and treat people like objects or treat people like animals. And I think that we're being asked to grow out of that whole mentality that doesn't see our shared humanity and doesn't actually know. And I think this is a big one for us in America, but really for all people everywhere, that our ultimate safety depends on us doing that. The more we traumatize other people, bomb them, kill them, hate them, enslave them, however we do it, the more victims we create who are symptomatic and who are going to act out. And we see that already with mass murders and continuing wars where the inhumanity that is perpetrated on untold numbers of completely innocent people is still something we're condoning.
I think we have to recognize the origins of this from the perspective of European settler colonialization as an economic engine. And that at the root of that is a form of feudalism that arose out of the Roman Catholic Church. And this idea of separation from God and that the redemption goes through a hierarchy. And so
Yes.
everyone is brought in at this level of, you can't actually gain access to your humanity without this hierarchy. And so you're subservient to the hierarchy. And then the hierarchy gets corrupted by its ability to wield power and then wield resources, which
Right.
at first is corrupted because of a benevolent intention, which is, oh, well, these folks don't know as much as I know. And so it's going to be really helpful if I help them be more sanitary and I help them those things. But then eventually it gets corrupted because it becomes more comfortable and convenient. And so when we forward that through the American Revolution, we have this legacy of settler colonialism that's based on the principle of a
Right.
hierarchical relationship, which has one people in the role of subservient, or what we would refer to in that idiom as peasant class, and then the other as ruling class. And that originated way deep, thousands of years ago, in the feudal system and the Dark Ages and those sorts of things. And so now we have this trauma, this intergenerational trauma that has people of European descent having an inordinate sense of superiority that's unconscious, that's based
Right.
on their context. And so getting them to the table of the discussion, you can see it just with the resistance to the evolution of things since George Floyd. And it goes a lot further back than George Floyd, but
Right.
this idea that there's this anti-wokeness thing is a kind of resistance to the therapeutic process. So is there anything that you've identified in your book that brings people to the table who have so much privilege that they don't have the impetus, the necessary discomfort to enter into the transformative process? Like with the South African example, those people lost a war. Like the Zulus beat them. And
Mhm.
so in this case, what's the scenario that as you imagine it in America in therapy? How do you see this unwinding?
Well, I would hope, and it is part of the motivation for what I wrote, and I think part of the motivation for many people is that we could actually wake up before we're in a third world war, before there's a pestilence that we can't come together or won't come together because we're still competing for who's going to make the most money off of the vaccine. Before there's something so dire that there's no choice but to actually come together and work together. And I think that's part of my intention and many people's intention. Can we wake each other up before that happens? Can we see the iceberg before we hit it? And I think that where we're going with the wars that we see in the world today, I mean, one of the things that really strikes me about the wars that we see in the world today is that in the news, I don't see, and I don't watch all the news, but I don't see like a rally cry for we have to stop this. It doesn't matter who it is. It doesn't matter who started it or who thinks they're right or who thinks they're wrong. The fallout for humanity is unacceptable. We have to bring our best minds together, our healers, our psychotherapists, our peacemakers, our mediators, our economists, our people, people of different religious orientations, whatever, whoever could have a voice at the table of how do we bring ourselves back from the possibility of a third world war, which people are talking about, or a civil war in the United States, which people are talking about. I think that we have to be proactive and try to implement some of the things we already know help families heal and help individuals heal before we get to that place.
Yeah, it's like a seed that gets planted in the fertile soil of transformation.
Right.
Well, there's a kind of deep inner aspect to the human being, which has in it a kind of echo of a past evolutionary necessity, which I see manifest in a bunch of different places, depending on which side of any kind of conflict. We have this impetus that turns toward the idea of coercion and might as
Right.
the most obvious solution. And so, for instance,
Mhm.
I'm deeply aligned with the deconstruction of what I will call predatory capitalism. I'm pro free enterprise, by the way, just to throw that out there. But
Mhm.
in it, we have the people who are rebelling. One of the things that I heard in the late 70s and early 80s was eat the rich, which is a form of violence, right? Because out of the inherent sort of natural phenomena that we eat things and we kill things for survival. So there's this deeply ingrained aspect of self which is rooted in violence. And I'm wondering what insight you could provide into that deeply rooted origin of this idea.
Well, I think it probably starts with us being animals, and we had to conquer something to survive. We had to spear the animal to have food, or we had to be powerful and conquer something to survive. And then it became conquering other groups of people who were maybe competing for the same resources, and it's mushroomed out into wider and wider areas of being able to conquer and subdue with our weapons, with our technologies, with our money, with our influence, on so many levels that we're actually already eating people. We're eating without consent. We're taking resources from people who are not giving them to us. We're emotionally feeding off of people's fears, and do you know what I'm saying? So we're already doing this. Might equals right is the paradigm that needs to go if
Well,
we're
but my
going to
question
survive
was
here. Yeah, go
about
ahead.
the deep origins, biological
Yes, it
origins of
is.
it.
Yeah.
And how would you address those? How do we unpack that? How do we deconstruct that?
Well, and again, I think the world of psychology offers such an easy way to look at that, which is that in a healthy family, we're not in that kind of fierce competition. It's not might equals right in a healthy family. There's some communication, there's cooperation, there's deep listening, there's care for the other person's welfare. So there's a real sense of mutuality. And that is the best food for human beings. People who are loved, who are cared for, who belong, who have a voice, who are in an environment that is committed to good boundaries. There's a place where I end and you begin, and committed to peaceful conflict resolution, don't become the murderers. They don't become the people who are out to steal from other people.
But doesn't the Maslow's hierarchy suggest that that's not possible for BIPOC people and cultures where they've got 500 years of violent oppression, that those people don't have access to that higher function in their brain as a result of the context of their oppression?
Well, that might be so, but where do we begin? There may
So
be
we must,
people who
yeah,
are, yeah,
we
there may
must
be
begin
people
with
who
ourselves and the
we have
family.
to begin with ourselves. Right.
Taking that thought you guys just voiced, begin with ourselves, it occurs to me that's the responsibility of America as a whole. And one
Right.
of the things I heard people talk about is how the fires in Maui that devastated the one town for sure, and the money that the federal government gave to heal there was practically nothing. And then you look at what the federal government is giving to Ukraine to help them in their war. It seems that we stepping into a place of healing would be wiser to give billions of dollars to the people of Maui to rebuild and heal, like to really give that money back to our populace, not from a place of we want to be stronger than everyone else, but as you said earlier, coming from that place of we're in a process of healing.
I think
Absolutely.
Maui's a bad example. Let's talk Compton or Baltimore.
Well, no, I don't think it's a bad example because the indigenous people of Hawaii were primarily
But the indigenous people of Hawaii were not the ones who had their houses burned down. Those were colonists.
there were a lot.
Well, yeah, you're right. You're right. But it's Maui's just such a
But
elitist
here's the thing,
model.
it's with the amount of money the federal government's giving overseas, with what you just said, it's not either or in our United States, it's and Compton and Watts
Mhm.
and New Orleans and
Mhm. Well, I completely agree with you 100%. I feel like one of the big issues is that our tax dollars, billions and billions of tax dollars, go to weapons and go to defense, and not to what people actually need to live healthy, sustainable, caring, safe lives. Um, so yeah, I mean, I agree with you on all
It's not
levels.
even our tax dollars. It's the credit that
Mhm.
that we're doing. We're printing that money. What we're giving in our taxes isn't even coming close to paying for that stuff. It's all just this idea of the etherical idea of the dollar
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
creating the resources for that stuff, and then it just
Right.
becomes debt. It's not even
Right.
real treasury stuff.
Right. And the point of that being that still, whether we're just printing the money or it's our tax dollars or whatever it is, the point of it being that that's what we're funding. That's what we're giving our time and energy to, instead of actually improving the lives of the people who live here.
Well, but in the case of Hurricane Katrina, we poured all that money into the FEMA for those people, and what that money went to corporations who provided these horrible trailers that were, toxic. And so it's still this idea that there's some intercedent, some corporate economic intercedence that happens. And I think we have to be willing to be called into being good to our neighbors. Like, that's the actual level of transmission. And
I
what I
agree.
received from your conversation so far is that the family unit, when we recognize ourselves in the local 5 meters to our experience, that's where the rubber really meets the road, not in these big
100%.
contextual sorts of ideas.
Right. Well, and I think that we're at a place in the evolution of our history where we have to bring what we're looking at to heal our families and make our communities safer to the national conversation, because it's so divisive and the threats of violence are so great. So I think that they're inextricable right now. But yes, the family and the family unit and the individual and the community is the bottom line, because people who have an opportunity to heal themselves and to become better neighbors are the ones who are going to advocate for
So if
changes on
you're
a bigger level.
So if you're listening to this conversation and you identify as a Republican, or if you're listening to this conversation as you identify as a liberal Democrat,
or
I'm
fifth.
asking you to go across the aisle and meet
Mhm.
that person and break down your concept of who they are and dismantle your concept of who they are and actually find out who they really are.
Yeah. I'm sure. I'm not sure what you're asking me to do right at this moment, though.
To go
Do you have any Republican neighbors?
I have Republican people in my family.
Yeah. So that's the job, is we go and we break down our preconceived notions of what they're willing to do, think, feel, and we actually get in the game of listening to them and asking them the questions. First of
Right.
all, the consent to have the conversation. That's number one, right?
Right, right. And there's a beautiful organization which I want to look into more, called the Braver Angels, which
Yep.
actually makes its mission to help decrease polarity by bringing people together to have that conversation. And those are the kind of things we want more of.
Because at the fundamental level, we all want safer streets, safer schools, enough organic food for everybody to be healthy, and good work to keep ourselves going. And there's people who don't profit from that, and
Right.
they are trying to keep us blind.
Okay, now that is sacrilegious what you just said. I can't even believe it.
Tell me what's going on.
I'm being sarcastic.
No.
I'm wondering, Phyllis, in this work you're doing, what is your daily practice, and maybe you don't have one, that keeps you in positive energy?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, one of the things is, I really try to practice what I'm preaching. And it's hard. And I say that because I want to say that it's not like, oh, you just flip a switch and then we're just all kind, loving human beings. We're reactive. We have wounds that get triggered. We have things that we want that somebody else doesn't want. I'm married to a really wonderful man, and we still have those moments where, we're like, I just can't make you see what you need to see. And of course, he feels the same way. And what I remember is the principles that I'm espousing. I really try to remember them the best I can, imperfectly. And I say imperfectly because we are imperfect, and it's 2 steps forward often and 1 step back. But making the effort makes all the difference. So I try to remember, like, how am I being in this conversation? Am I talking in a way that actually I would want you to talk to me? Am I rolling my eyes, or am I really looking at you and listening and opening myself to a different point of view that overtly I don't agree with? Is there something I need to take responsibility for here? Maybe the way I'm talking isn't good, or maybe I really do have a closed mind about this issue, or maybe I just want things my way and I'm trying to push that. Is there something I need to apologize for? Is there some way that I could move toward resolution with you and reconnection with you that's authentic? Because that's the goal. For me, that's the goal. And that's what I don't see happening, on some of the larger levels in our country, that the goal isn't resolution. The goal is, I'm going to win this fight. I'm going to win this election, and the fallout, I don't care.
How do people find your book, and how do people get in touch with you?
Yeah, my book is on all the major booksellers, Amazon and Barnes and Noble and all those things. You can find it on my website as well.
And what's that?
My website is just my name. It's www.phyllislevitt.com, and I have articles and blogs and videos, and I'm on LinkedIn and YouTube and all the things.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, and we're at the point now where there's a question that Greg and I ask every guest. And we want to preface this by letting you know that while it may seem silly at first, it's actually deeply meaningful for us. And we are hoping that you can answer as transparently and honestly as you can. And the question is, Greg?
Eminem or Foo Fighters?
I'm too old for that question.
No, you're not.
I know who they are, but I don't really even know their music. So you've dated me. You'll have to ask my kids.
See, that's a perfectly sound answer to that question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, we got our laugh in.
Yeah. Thank you so much for what you're doing with this book, the hope and inspiration that inspired the work. I see you. And for raising your voice.
Thank you. And for you. And for, I really want to honor both of you. First of all, you're great podcasters, and you ask really deep questions. So I love that. And I really appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you very much.
Recording stopped.